that iconic music can mean only one thing. Bond. James Bond. Funny how author Ian Fleming picked that name because he considered it the dullest name possible, and that's what he wanted 007 to be. Dull. At least, so far as his personality was concerned. More people are familiar with James Bond from the characterization Sean Connery crafted. Suave, charismatic, he has a sense of humor, doesn't mind joking around, and is unflappable in any situation. Fleming was not a huge fan of that depiction. The original Bond character, especially in early novels, was designed to be a dull person without much personality. In Fleming's own words, a dull, blunt instrument who was flung into incredible events. He rarely initiates his adventures. He's usually assigned to them. This is an accidental stroke of genius. The less detail in any fictional character, the more the audience fills in the gaps with what they like. Still, Bond needed some degree of persona, and to that end, Ian Fleming injected aspects of himself. Many problematic aspects of Bond's personality are typically where Ian Fleming used himself as a character model. Fleming's own love letters show a tendency to be unkind, distant, and violently inclined to whipping women, not just in a bondage sense, straight up whipping. Furthermore, he sometimes seemed to be practicing pickup lines for Bond to use, lines that would make a porn star cringe. However, those advances, being fictional, were always successful. Such lines are a staple of the films and novels and inspired Sam Hutchinson to write, "They made Bond a, quote, sleazy sex pest." Still, one of Fleming's friends is quoted as saying, "The trouble with Ian is that you have to get yourself killed before he feels anything." This is perhaps in reference to two women with whom Fleming was once romantically involved, Edith Morpurgo, who died in Auschwitz, and Muriel Wright, who died during the German Blitz on London. Writer Ben McIntyre described Wright as the ultimate Bond girl, saying, quote, "fun, pliant, uncomplaining, and then abruptly and tragically dead." Again, there are problems with Bond's conduct, and whatever their origin doesn't excuse them, but I think there are better, more qualified people than I to explore specific issues as well as propose remedies for them. Check out the works of Laura Mulvaney, Clementine Ford, and Linda Lindsay. Still, that does segue into what I want to talk about most. James Bond is in a position to largely be revised as a character. Most of what people know about the character comes from the films. There's no denying that. As such, if there is going to be a change, it will most likely come from film. Part of what's holding it back is the formula. And make no mistake, there is a formula. When writing You Only Live Twice, writer Roald Dahl, yes, that Roald Dahl, author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, The Witches, and The Fantastic Mr. Fox, was given a specific formula to follow, especially when writing women. He said, quote, "You put in 3 girls. Girl number 1 is pro-Bond. She stays around roughly through the first reel of the picture. Then she is bumped off by the enemy, preferably in Bond's arms. The next girl is anti-Bond, and normally captures him, but Bond will save himself by using his charm and sexual potency. She's killed midway through the film. Girl number 3 will survive, and end the film in Bond's embrace." End quote. That movie was made in the late 1960s, yet that formula has clearly been followed since then. Furthermore, it speaks to confines the character is trapped in. Sure, that routine portrayal makes money, but whatever comfort some find in familiarity is preventing the character from evolving. One trick that can help revise Bond is humanizing. Consider the Daniel Craig era, wherein Bond's adventures take a toll. This was a routine aspect in the novels. Bond is generally a wreck by the end of most adventures, and that wreckage lingers, physically and psychologically. For instance, on the back of his hand are Cyrillic letters for SH, pertaining to the word Spion, which is Russian for spy, carved into him at the end of Casino Royale to mark him as an agent of espionage. Plastic surgery helps hide the scar, but Bond is always aware, can see hints of it where cosmetic correction failed. It's always there like a looming sign of his, not only who he is, but his possible death, because if anybody even remotely recognizes those scars, he'll be outed as a spy, and his life will be in danger. This persistence of wreckage is definitely the case in the film Skyfall, which begins with Bond almost dying, and when he returns to the field, he is clearly not at the top of his game. A humanized Bond is, I dare say, allowed to be flawed, thereby making his actions not necessarily the behavior of an idealized individual, some kind of Ur male, but the product of a savage, most likely short-lived lifestyle, living wreckage unable to feel or connect healthily with another human being. Nowhere is this better demonstrated than the novel version of Moonraker. The novel and the film are vastly different. Normally, a film adaptation allows you to at least know plot points. These two are completely different stories, only vaguely connecting to one another. In the movie, Roger Moore stars as 007. Space stations are going to be used by a billionaire to nerve gas the entire planet, which he'll then repopulate with his chosen survivors, a diverse group of people he considers genetically perfect. In the book, Bond discovers a very successful businessman who has been developing for England what is essentially the world's first ICBM, an amazingly prescient narrative choice considering the book came out about 2 years before the intercontinental ballistic missile became reality. Bond discovers this businessman is actually a Nazi. Seeing Germany about to lose, he assumed a fake identity and fled to England. His intention is to fire the missile, but have it strike London with a Soviet nuclear warhead. He's also plotting to use the calamity to clean up in the stock market. Nuclear war, fear of rocket attack, Soviet plots, the evil greed of capitalists, Nazis. This book hits all the buttons, especially for anyone living in that time, because all those things were real fresh tears. It's also a story where Bond doesn't get the girl, finds himself frequently losing fights, and constantly questioning if he should keep being a 00. The job is literally killing him. He sees zero bright future on the horizon. While Skyfall touched on these elements, I think that questioning, that doubt should be more present in the films. Something else to keep in mind. Bond doesn't exist in a vacuum, though one can see why people might make that mistake. For decades, he fought the Cold War because the Cold War went on for decades. Now the world is a different place, which reveals a weakness in the formula as well as an opportunity. Bond films occasionally try to tap into a larger zeitgeist than the formulaic spy versus spy plot at work. License to Kill finds 007 going after drug dealers, obviously a nod to the prominent US war on drugs at the time. GoldenEye surprisingly self-reflects on the need for a Bond-type individual in a post-Cold War world. Casino Royale finds the character chasing the operator of what is essentially a secret bank for terrorists, a highly relevant concept following 9/11. So Bond is capable of touching on culturally relevant themes, albeit with a broad stroke. Also, Fleming was clearly receptive to what fans wanted. Take, for instance, the original Bond gun for the first 5 novels was a .25 caliber ACP Beretta. This changed when Fleming received a letter from Geoffrey Boothroyd, a gun expert and Bond fan. Boothroyd proposed the switch to the Walther PPK, a gun that is so synonymous with Bond. In the movie GoldenEye, it's referenced as a way of identifying him. Anyone armed with a Walther PPK is suspected of being James Bond. In addition, as gadgets became more popular in the films, they made more appearances in the books. Essentially, the books became more like the films as time went by. If the original author is willing to revise the character to fit movie audiences' taste, then why not consider that permission to revise Bond on screen? Perhaps therein lies part of the difficulty. Bond is written for the fans. Bond is written for the fans. So is what they want him to be. That brings us to considering what the character is meant to be. The first Bond novel was released on the 13th of April, 1953. This isn't even 10 years since the Second World War ended. The effects of that devastating conflict are still relatively fresh in European minds. Remember, entire cities were obliterated, as well as the infrastructure necessary to do things like feed and clothe people. The war didn't end, then life got right back to normal. Everything had to be rebuilt. For instance, factory workers had no jobs because factories had to be built. They were bombed out of existence. Additionally, The war was a time of deprivation, scarcity, and constant terror. Then, keep in mind, rationing was still going on in England when the first book was released. A politician in the 1950s, leader of England's Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell, received an advanced copy of Dr. No and said, "The combination of sex, violence, alcohol, and, at intervals, good food and nice clothes is, to one who lives such a circumscribed life as I do, irresistible." Bond therefore becomes this vicarious thrill and source of comfort. He travels the globe, going places some people at the time never even heard of. He indulges in fine dining. Although he himself is earning a comfortable £53,000 a year, about 64 grand US, Bond is never extravagant until on assignment, when he has an unlimited expense account. He isn't flashy with his own cash, but he will spend every dollar in the boss's wallet. The books aren't the height of literary excellence, but they are solidly intended as escapism, especially for a world rebuilding after a devastating conflict. Furthermore, they're meant for a British world, an empire fading quickly, the last crumbs in its imperial treasury soon to vanish. Then along comes Bond, like some kind of standard bearer, boldly asserting that Britain, and by extension its people, are still the most sophisticated individuals on the planet, so much so, only one of their own can save the world. One thing the Bond films and books have always had in common is that they're about order. Even the calamity and destruction that occurs are all part of some orchestrated plot. Nothing happens by chance. There's no chaos in the Bond universe. Either the Soviet Union, Spectre, Smersh, Quantum, or some lone wolf, well-financed psychopath, Christopher Walken, is conducting a symphony of destruction, and it's Bond's job to regain the reins. A central theme of these stories is dominance and order, so maybe now it's time for Bond to confront chaos. Hack writers will instantly jump to making a Joker for James Bond. That would be incredibly wrong. Consider the first half of the film is discovering a nefarious plot to do whatever, but this will result in an unintended snowball effect. Now the villain has to be on Bond's side because, let's say, chaos is bad for business. The scheme itself then becomes the villain, an ideology that grows out of control. There's no longer a centralized source of danger, but a nebulous, amorphous hazard growing exponentially. A sort of poetic entropy takes place in the world of espionage, where their constant struggle to maintain order and a dominating upper hand has put the world in danger, and this time, the only way to win might be to lose. Who knows? Producers might just hammer such an idea until it fits in the hole laid out by the formula. There are hints of it in films like Skyfall and GoldenEye. Still, if we can't change Bond the character himself, perhaps we can at least change the characters around him. The way the supporting cast reacts to him can at least put the notion of change on the screen. It sort of establishes a dialogue in a way. What we have is a character who's intended to be a vicarious thrill, but who is the product of a very specific era. This escapism embraces a view of the world that's been described as imperialist nostalgia, and encapsulates the romantic mindset of a cold, whip-happy misogynist. The success of the films then formalize this narrative and character so that everyone who ever gets a crack at a blank Bond page is shackled by that dynamic. It's time to lose the formula and find out if Bond can grow outside the confines of his cage. There are hints throughout the novels and films that it is possible.